Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Faulconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history by the stories we learn. John J. Dwyer, what is this story?
This is a story too big to tell in one program, Gwen, so we're going to go not one, not two, but three. The historic 1980s Oklahoma oil boom and bust. The state of the state is great, declared Governor George Nye at the height of that historic boom in the late 70s and early 80s. And who could argue? It wasn't just the Oklahoma Sooners football team that was number one in the nation. Beginning the decade, the state had America's lowest unemployment rate, 3.6%. It crested the 3 million mark in population. Record numbers of drilling rigs pumped up in nearly every county across the state, with more in production. Tens of thousands of people streamed into the center state rather than out of it. Never had Oklahomans seen more automobile license plates from places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, and Kansas. It was altogether a new Wild West. So how in the Sam Hill did it happen? Well, we're delivering it to you, as we said, in three programs. We're going to look at the backstory to the boom and that remarkable phenomenon itself. Next time, we'll tackle the historic bust. Then with the third show, we'll explore the unexpected blessing that accrued from it. A blessing, I might add, that I'm not certain would have occurred in most places outside Oklahoma. So first, the boom. A 19-day war way back in 1973 between two ancient enemies, half a world away, set in motion the long march toward Oklahoma's great late 20th century reckoning. The USA provided crucial aid during this war to assist its close ally Israel in fighting off the latest in a series of attacks from the latter's hostile Arab neighbors. An angry organization of Arab petroleum exporting countries, however, whom Americans had taught the oil and gas business to, now held a significant share of worldwide production. Its members conspired to cut their production and raise their prices to perceived enemies such as increasingly foreign energy-dependent America. All of this drove the price of energy derived from fossil fuels, oil as well as natural gases, such as ethane, methane, propane, and butane, upward in the United States, as long lines formed at gas stations in Oklahoma and across the nation. A series of unwise federal laws in the 1970s and 80s, crafted by officials who apparently knew little about the oil and gas industry, of which Oklahoma has long been a towering giant, and apparently disliked what they did know, worsened the situation for the American public. So did the violent, hardline Islamic regime that rose to power in Iran in 1979, which cut their own oil supply off to America. Then came the hyperinflation that spawned the misery index of skyrocketing national prices, interest rates, and unemployment during the late 1970s presidency of devout World War II naval veteran Jimmy Carter. Federal regulations that hamstrung the profitability of normal natural gas plays ironically helped cock back the trigger of a historic deep drilling boom for natural gas in the sprawling Anadarko Basin of western Oklahoma. Many in the industry saw this as the best way to access vast enough deposits to finally generate profits. President Ronald Reagan's first executive order upon taking office of eliminating oil and natural gas prices pulled that trigger. The magnetic champion of this epic effort was Oklahoma City deep gas exploration visionary Robert Hefner III. The Wonder Boy geologist and scion of a prominent Oklahoma pioneer family, Bob Hefner had pursued the holy grail of 5-mile-plus deep gas exploration in the Anadarko for decades. He'd already drilled the deepest well in history in the Anadarko, 6 miles down. But government price controls had prevented such expensive deep plays from making money. Hefner believed he had authored the formula that could now monetize for his Glover Hefner Kennedy Company, or GHK, and monetize it spectacularly, the colossal investment necessary to plumb the earth there to unprecedented depths. That is where Hefner believed lay a historic, untapped ocean of subterranean natural gas. More importantly, he believed this was the lone hope for long-term American fossil fuel energy production. Meanwhile, the charismatic Hefner persuaded Penn Square Bank chairman Beep Jennings that his growing Southern Plains portfolio was just the ticket for the small Oklahoma City Bank's bold new oil and gas division. Ramrodded by flamboyant young bank vice president Bill Patterson, that division was mounting a historic play of its own for investment capital that could fund Hefner and 1,000 other prospectors of solid and not so solid pedigree. At first ignored, then viewed with bemusement by the state's traditional commercial and financial powers, Penn Square meant business. No one was laughing when the upstart parking lot bank, as it was called, adjacent to OKC's Penn Square Mall, wrestled dozens of big customers away from First National Bank in Oklahoma City. The state's financial Rock of Gibraltar, that institution had been founded the year of the 1889 land run. Adding insult to injury, Penn Square hijacked numerous First National lending officers. Amidst this gold rush mentality, First National and nearly everyone else piled in with a vengeance. Banked to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars by Penn Square, meanwhile, Hefner now spudded the Anadarko with unparalleled resolve. A virtual invasion of other explorers followed suit. Some struck rich oil or gas deposits, but many of them never needed even to punch red dirt with a drill bit to get rich. Rarely did banks, much less the far larger army of individual investors, know whether their money had even resulted in an actual drilling effort, Gwen, but the boom was on. Gwen, I might ask you, looking back to the early 1980s, what do you recollect from that time?
I remember the flamboyant stories of Beep Jennings drinking champagne out of his cowboy boot.
Yeah, I think everything from champagne to margaritas to lemonade's been remembered in those stories about the boys drinking out of their cowboy boots at Cowboys Saloon out there. I think not far from where we are right now, Northwest Expressway.
I did not realize, though, that Penn Square Bank stole customers and investors from First National and these other major banks.
Well, I think depending on the point of view, whether they stole them or they actually just won them away. They outcompeted for them. They had better packages. Yeah, it was a very seductive and siren call that even these great old institutions got into as they saw this bank getting bigger and bigger out in the mall of Penn Square Mall where Cheesecake Factory is now.
We're talking about the oil boom. This is Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history by the stories you tell. John J. Dwyer, the oil boom had all this controversy?
Controversy on a scale never before seen. And Gwen, as we explore in greater detail in our book, Oklahomans 2, late 1970s and early 1980s, Oklahoma experienced not only an oil and gas boom, but record high construction and real estate sales, and booming markets for livestock and agriculture. Home, automobile, and land transactions in the early 1980s reached unprecedented levels. Moderately skilled blue-collar workers found themselves earning six-figure incomes in energy or energy-generated businesses. Mick Cornett, Oklahoma City mayor, later from 2004 to 16, revealed that Oklahoma crude oil prices catapulted tenfold from 1972 to 1982. Oil and gas industry employment tripled in the same time from 34,000 to over 100,000. Oklahoma had been a poor state for a long time, Cornett said, But by 1982, the state's per capita income was almost identical to the national rate. Normally, an Oklahoman would have to pursue a bank to secure even a modest-sized loan. By 1980, however, banks hired whole staffs with orders to chase down loan prospects. Some of these plungers were promoted into the highest rungs of their corporate ladders. Once found, the loan prospect often received a previously unheard of 100% in cash of the requested loan amount on a property or business or drilling package. If he or she was a particularly good prospect, the bank might even recruit them as a board member of a new bank it was sponsoring and loan them 100% of the cash needed to purchase their new bank stock. Yes, you heard that right. And if all that taxed the local bank, or even if it didn't, the bank would upstream some, often all of the loan paper, often even interest payments, to one of the horde of larger banks swarming the state from across the nation to get in on the bonanza. And we're talking giants of the industry like Chase Manhattan, Continental Illinois, Michigan National, Northern Trust, and Seattle Seafirst, who all dispatched their own teams of representatives to battle their coast-to-coast competitors. The prize? The right to shovel millions and tens and hundreds of millions of dollars into the small, comparatively poor population of Oklahoma. The local bank, meanwhile, would clip a hefty loan servicing fee and often snag a grateful new, usually local depositor with a freshly enhanced bank account. Meanwhile, unprecedented tax proceeds from the state's blazing hot private sector piled up a colossal $100 million surplus in state coffers amidst a colorful cowboy culture of boots, two-stepping, snuff-dipping, and mechanical bucking bulls that swept the nation. Those who lived through these new Wild West days of Oklahoma witnessed exploits at which previous generations would surely have marveled and perhaps blushed. We're talking lavish Oklahoma City bars and nightclubs featuring scantily clad young women engaging in staged public mud wrestling contests. Nose candy, cocaine, and other recreational drug use ran rampant in many affluent and non-affluent sectors. Luxurious homes featuring sculpted lawns watered against scalding Southern Plains heat, jacuzzis, and other adornments spawned drunken and debauched parties, immoral acts, and divorce on a scale hitherto unknown in Oklahoma. To a degree that would shock most contemporary Oklahomans, women of all races in the workplace were subjected to widespread and widely accepted sexual innuendo and harassment. They lacked the corporate or legal redress for this that's available decades into the 21st century. Societal mores frequently prevented them from corporate advances for which they were qualified, and just as often perceived them literally as ornaments or eye candy, as it was called, for the promotion of business. Indeed, the Me Too movement, including in Buckle of the Bible Belt, Oklahoma, did not emerge from a vacuum. Builders, meanwhile, seeking financing, submitted fraudulent qualifying documentation to bankers who happily approved loans without conducting proper due diligence. The banks often did the same for oil companies who offered as collateral unrealized energy production earnings or drilling and production equipment that outside of such an aberrant economic cycle would have possessed scant marketable value. Meanwhile, wealthy clergymen built immense churches, financed personal jets, and collected their own private zoos replete with lions and other exotic animals. Petroleum landmen leased mineral rights from landowners for exorbitant sums. Then the landowners often shoveled percentage of the inflated sums back to the landmen, who stuffed them into their own pockets, not their companies. Or the landmen alerted other production companies to available mineral interests, and the production company representatives bought the interests at high dollar, kicking back a percentage to the landmen and putting outrageous amounts of money in the pockets of the mineral interest owner. All the while, the bills streamed back to profit-flush oil companies who ultimately passed them on to the buyer at the pump or thermostat. This golden nugget sports a different shine, Gwen. The history of humanity is replete with earthly success and material prosperity sowing the seeds of its own destruction. The Bible declares that God is not mocked, for whatever a person sows, this he will also reap. Also that in the blink of an eye, wealth disappears, for it will sprout wings and fly away like an eagle. Oklahoma was about to get a hard reminder of these inescapable laws, and we'll talk about them next time in Part 2, Bust.
The New Wild West. Now that's Oklahoma gold. Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Falconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we lived. John J. Dwyer, what's this story?
Gwen, last time we recalled the historic Oklahoma oil boom of the late 1970s and early 1980s. It triggered an unprecedented material prosperity for the state and, unfortunately, a corresponding level of irresponsible behavior. Well, the racehorse Oklahoma economy started leveling off around the late spring and summer of 1981. Federal banking regulators had issued a series of warnings to Oklahoma City's Penn Square and other banks stretching back at least 2 years. These concern their eye-popping lending practices, particularly toward the energy sector. Undercapitalization, slipshod paperwork and accounting, sudden and uncontrolled growth, and other concerns. The tidal wave of profit, power, and prestige, however, proved more persuasive than all the ominous signs and admonitions. Monday, July 5th, 1982, dawned as a sunny post-Independence Day vacation respite for most Oklahomans. Not everyone was resting or recreating, however. Federal bank regulators were busy shutting down Penn Square Bank. The reckless nature of the energy lending practices that had landed it at the epicenter of the nation's oil boom were now painfully apparent to investigators. Little did anyone suspect on that hot July day, however, that the once modest little bank, now OKC's fourth largest, that sat in the parking lot of a North Oklahoma City shopping center would eventually drag some of the nation's greatest financial institutions down with it, as well as much of the southwest U.S. economy, especially that of Oklahoma. Visionary geologist and deep gas drilling pioneer Robert Hefner III and his GHK company were the giant of western Oklahoma. Hefner personally participated in hundreds of drilling projects and had hundreds of millions of dollars of loans in play. With his favored capital source of Penn Square and the Titans upstream from it now sidelined and facing the same crushing expenses that had bedeviled deep gas drilling efforts for generations, Hefner's budding oil and gas empire tottered. When it did, the effect was less of a ripple and more of a prairie grass inferno. Other exploration companies, dangling out over their own massively leveraged abysses, toppled like dominoes as their own funding streams shriveled. Soon, unused drilling rigs littered the Oklahoma landscape. Within a year of the Penn Square collapse, the number in use dropped from 900 to 200. Bankruptcies proliferated and other banks crashed. The 1980s bust was not a single cataclysm like later tragedies from which Oklahomans began immediately to dig out. The fall of Penn Square Bank immediately struck thousands of people, to be sure. Overall, however, it was more like a fire bell in the day, which foreshadowed the long and agonizing doom of a historic bust. Longer and slower than anyone could have imagined, celebrated future OKC Mayor Mick Cornett said. The collapse of Penn Square was really just the beginning of a long slide for Oklahoma, end quote. Banking executive Lee Simcox was a young manager in his family's City National Bank of Norman, then the state's fourth largest city, in the early 1980s. He recalled that neither the boom nor the bust were strictly oil and gas affairs. Soaring incomes from the latter generated a tidal wave of federal tax-favored real estate investment to reduce personal tax exposure. This in turn inflated real estate values. Simcox recalled, the oil bust is not what took down the banks in Norman and a lot of other towns in Oklahoma. Despite Penn Square, he said, things were going pretty good in Norman up until 1984. Then the government changed the tax laws. That is what triggered everything to go over the cliff. It took away a lot of the tax benefits for investing in real estate. Suddenly, a lot of real estate deals no longer worked economically. Also, the massive influx of money for investment was gone because there was no longer any oil money. It all snowballed at once, end quote. Simcox went on to describe the economic horror cycle that now commenced. As with related events, the federal government unwittingly contributed to the devastation. Quoting Simcox again, once the banks started failing, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, came in. Then on top of already having a bad real estate market, the FDIC would dump the real estate which they got from shuttered banks on the market. This would further depress the real estate market, which would then make another bank go bad. It was a self-perpetuating situation, end quote. As Cornett suggested, it went further and longer than anyone imagined. In 1986, 4 long years after Penn Square fell, Simcox's fellow banks in Norman only then began to topple, all 7 of them. Then on July 14th of the same year, the Grand Gray Lady herself, the legendary First National Bank of Oklahoma City, went down under hundreds of millions of dollars of oil, gas, and real estate authored red ink. Its leader, civic luminary C.A. Vos, resigned after 65 years at the bank. With 90% of his immense family fortune evaporated, he died less than 5 months later. The bank's former CEO, meanwhile, was convicted of 5 felonies, fined millions of dollars, and narrowly escaped serving prison time. Indeed, Oklahoma City was absorbing a king-size helping of the debacle. The city lost the National Finals Rodeo, known as the Super Bowl of pro rodeo, and its many millions of annual revenue dollars to Las Vegas in 1984. In 1985, it became the largest city in America not to host an NCAA Division I athletic program when Oklahoma City University dropped to the NAIA. In 1988, the city's most iconic hotel, the Skirvin, closed its doors. Small wonder when OKC had the lowest hotel occupancy rate, 38%, of any American city with a population over 250,000. And in a moment, we'll look at the devastating impact of all these events on the people of Oklahoma. And Gwen, I'll throw it back to you. What's your recollection of these times in the mid to late 80s as things were changing in Oklahoma?
I don't think I realized that the banks are so tied to the real estate that we're so tied to everything else. And apparently it's all interconnected.
Well, it is. And, we think of it as a time of an oil boom and bust, which it was. But I think Lee Simcox, who many people know even today is the very successful chairman, very wise chairman of First Fidelity banks in Oklahoma and other states, he remembered firsthand. That's why it's important to write these things down while people are still around that were involved. He remembered how the wiser banks were getting out of it when the federal laws on real estate tax shelters changed and the real estate market dried up. And that's what was the tipping point that pushed us over the cliff.
Oklahoma, the bust. I wonder what the golden nugget will be. This is Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we hear. Collateral damage? Was it really like dominoes? John J. Dwyer, tell us about the bust of Oklahoma.
It was the mother of all domino games, Gwen. Statewide in Oklahoma, the bust, unemployment in 1986, again, that's 4 years after Penn Square Bank went down, was double what it was 5 years before. Future OKC Mayor Mick Cornett recalled that tens of thousands of young people were flocking out of Oklahoma for brighter futures in Texas, California, and elsewhere. In another reminder of the comprehensive economic devastation of the bust, 18,000 Oklahoma farmers lost their land in the 1980s due to the financial upheaval. Oil prices, meanwhile, had plummeted roughly from $100 a barrel to $42 in 2020's dollars. As Oklahoma's Great Near Depression ground on, two devastating furies of collateral destruction gathered force that extended it into the next decade. One struck thousands of Oklahomans who had acted responsibly, even wisely, during the gathering dizziness of the boom. These folks had circumspectly sized up investment opportunities in land, oil and gas, banks, and other institutions. They hadn't expected get-rich-quick schemes, nor had they pursued other quixotic notions. Unfortunately, as recalled by Oklahoma City businessman Richard Anderson, those loans we signed back then were called joint and several. That meant if one person couldn't pay, the rest of the loan signees had to pay. So we got stuck with other people's loans, end quote. Thus, responsible investors and business people could suddenly be ravaged, even bankrupted, by the unwise actions of other people.
Of their friends.
Of their former friends. Yes, and that wasn't all. The FDIC, as it investigated troubled banks, would often demand immediate and full payment on those loans from anyone who signed them, especially when lent by a bank that was failing or had already failed. Indeed, the federal government itself emerged as that second destructive force, as Bank Chairman Lee Simcox remembered. Land development is a perfect example, Simcox recalled. We had some sound developers as customers. They had a lot of good cash equity in their projects, and their lots were selling for, say, $40,000 apiece. Then you've got the guy next door who's highly leveraged, and he loses his deal. Now the FDIC is going to take all this inventory, perhaps 200 lots, put it onto the market, and sell those $40,000 lots, making the responsible developer's lots worth $25,000. Plus, he can't sell them anyway because the FDIC has undercut him on the price. So his good deal, and perhaps his entire business, goes bad too, end quote. Indeed, the supposedly staunchly free market Reagan administration feared a national financial meltdown. So, in a hotly divided decision, it poured billions into Continental Illinois, whose insolvency dwarfed that of any Oklahoma bank, to save it, or at least to keep its husk propped up long enough to be subsumed by Bank America. But a Texas and Oklahoma meltdown was allowed, and by panicked feds who wound up in effect shooting banks and a multitude of their loan customers and even depositors first and asking questions later. Thus was born the new normal of a select few financial institutions important to the national power establishment centered in Washington, D.C. and New York City, and regardless of their degree of credulity and avarice, being deemed too big to fail. Simcox brought us today's golden nugget when he recalled, Gwen, a memorable visit to his family's Norman Bank by a federal bank examiner in the late 80s. Every other bank in Norman had already failed, but the Simcox's tightly disciplined City National Bank was well on its way to weathering the bust. After only a brief time on site, however, the man declared, "Your bank will not survive." Again exhibiting the previously described out-of-staters' lynch mob mentality, the hasty examiner failed to recognize that we didn't make loan decisions like every other bank in town, Simcox recalled. He added that such actions led to much more carnage in Oklahoma than was necessary. Well, years later, Lee Simcox visited with that same examiner in Washington, D.C. The man was now Deputy Comptroller of the Currency for the United States. He clearly remembered Simcox and his City National Bank. He had the chance, Simcox said, to retract some of the declarations he'd made to us back in the 1980s, or even to congratulate us on our surprising survival. The now ascendant former bank examiner declined to do either. Indeed, as we'll see next time, Gwen, many Oklahomans did actually keep their heads during this historic boom acted responsibly, and came out very well. And that's a golden nugget we need to remember.
Oklahoma, the boom, the bust, and the blessing is yet to come. Now that's Oklahoma Gold. Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Faulconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we understand. We talked about the oil boom. We talked about the economic and oil bust. John J. Dwyer, what is the blessing?
Well, Gwen, the preceding two programs, we've explored the historic late 1970s, early 1980s Oklahoma oil and gas boom, the irresponsible behavior that contributed to and resulted from it, the devastating bust that followed, and the lasting consequences. But I'm happy to say that today's program, which explores the blessings and lessons learned from this difficult time in state history, will be much more encouraging, and it will involve some names quite familiar to many of you listening. So, as more than 200 other Oklahoma banks failed, how did two small-town banking families survive this economic debacle, gradually gather wind in their sails, then rocket forward from the early 90s into multi-billion-dollar financial institutions that have helped take the state to the next level? Head down, rear up, working hard, said H.E. Gene Rainbolt, founder of modern-day Bank First, the largest state-chartered bank in Oklahoma. Worrying, he said, every night at 3 a.m. It was a tough time. Every day we would ask ourselves, are we going to make it? Gene Rainbolt, his son David, and their colleagues bear a lasting testament to Oklahoma that even when the world around you is spiraling downward, if you exercise discipline, wisdom, and poise, you don't have to follow. Gene Rainbolt worked from nearly the start of his own banking career in Noble around 1960 to build better financial institutions than those of his comfortable competitors that owned many of the state's banks at the time. In Oklahoma's era of unit banking laws, which prohibited banks expanding beyond a single location, hard to believe now, Rainbolt launched an ingenious long-game strategy. He began to purchase, with separate ownership teams, troubled small-town banks. He simultaneously assembled a crack executive team known as Thunderbird Financial Corporation. Thunderbird functioned as a paid contractor and delivered revolutionary bottom-up budgeting, accounting, central investment, and loan quality processes to each bank. This expertise and uniformity enhanced each bank's competence while reducing their overhead. Meanwhile, he worked for decades to eliminate those archaic unit banking laws so that successful Oklahoma banks could expand beyond one location and grow, helping rev up the state's economic engine. With the 80s bust, Gene found foxhole converts among his former adversaries to the notion of multi-bank holding companies. Many of those comfortable competitors desperately sought a buyer before the feds shut them down. Gene Rainbolt's legendary 1983 oration to the state legislature electrified that body into authoring the first of a series of laws that buried unit banking. The next year, he formed United Community Corporation, Oklahoma's first statewide multi-bank holding company. David Rainbolt, meanwhile, left Republic Bank in Dallas to join his father's team in 1982. Father and son both came to consider the younger Rainbolt the more strategic thinker of the two. He proceeded to sharpen the company's strategic focus and long game. He ramrodded a further round of organizational upgrades that included enhanced scrutiny of loan applicants' credit quality as well as the novel practice of a rigorous loan review process. United began all this shortly before Oklahoma City's Penn Square Bank collapsed in 1982, as we discussed in the last program. It rejected the sort of profitable but risky loans that were seducing other state banks in that swashbuckling era. In fact, we began moving the worst of our loans out of our bank, David recalled, which gave us a crucial 24-month head start before the real estate market tanked in 1984 or 85, and before others realized how bad the state's economy was, end quote. By 1989, as Oklahoma banks continued to fail, the state's economy remained stalled, and the high-flying OKC and Tulsa banking communities lay in shambles. The Rainbolts shifted to offense. They merged their many banks into one, the now renowned Bank First. They moved for the first time into the big cities and cherry-picked top executives from shattered metropolitan banks. In 1992, David Rainbolt became CEO and took Bank First public, raising capital through the markets rather than debt. This allowed the organization to initiate next-level loans, as well as to better weather cyclical economic downturns. As the decade unfolded and Oklahoma's economic skies cleared, Bank First became a financial juggernaut across a state littered with the wreckage of less prudent institutions. Meanwhile, the bank population in Norman had grown to 8 by the height of the 80s boom. When the smoke cleared, only one of those survived with previous ownership. City National Bank remained afloat, Norman native Gene Rainbolt recalled, because owner and banking legend Raymond Simcox kept his composure, and all 4 Simcoxes in the business exercised good judgment. Raymond's grandson Lee Simcox, who we talked about in the last program, merged City National with American Fidelity Insurance owners Bill and Linda Cameron's First Fidelity Bank in 1992. Simcox has been part owner, president, and CEO of First Fidelity ever since. It has grown into a multi-billion-dollar institution. Lee was a green 20-something banker at Citi, though, in Norman when the roof caved in on Oklahoma in the 80s. He chafed at his grandfather's refusal to make a major loan to a prominent Norman real estate developer and City National customer. "I told him we're going to lose this deal," Lee Simcox recalled. "All these other banks are growing like crazy, and we're not." "The other banks are concerned with the wrong bottom line," Raymond Simcox wisely told his grandson. "They're more worried with growing the bottom line of their balance sheet. I'm more concerned with growing the bottom line of my income statement." End quote. "You can be big and not make any money," Lee summarized. "That stuck with me to this day." Anyhow, that developer got his loan somewhere else and was foreclosed on 2 years later. He went bankrupt, and so did that other bank, end quote. What the philosophy of my grandfather, dad, and uncle all boils down to, Lee Simcox concluded, is that you stick with your basic principles. Never let your competition dictate your rates, terms, and credit and loan decisions. If everyone had done that in the 70s and 80s, it would have been all right. But people got their head over their skis and away from their basic banking principles, such as the customer's ability to repay. Well, the bold Rainbolts and scrupulous Simcoxes took different roads to success, Gwen, but both made it when most around them did not. People in communities across Oklahoma are fortunate they did, and they are the beneficiaries of something else as well, which we'll discuss following the break.
So the golden nugget is the blessing?
Blessing coming out of busts, heartbreaks, and tragedies. What a story of Oklahoma history.
Now that's Oklahoma gold. Dignifying our history by learning our history. John J. Dwyer, the boom, the bust. And now there's a blessing?
There's a blessing. One of the things that we've strived for in our Oklahomans, the story of Oklahoma and its people, both Volume 1 and Volume 2, is to dig the gold. You came up with the name, the Golden Nugget. out of apparently sorrowful and mournful events, which many times do have sorrowful things to them. The oil bust of the 80s, the economic bust of the 80s, and an accurate appraisal of that historic time necessitates indeed some difficult considerations and reckonings, as we've explored through the past 2.5 episodes of Oklahoma Gold. But it doesn't have to end there, we say in our books and here on Oklahoma Gold. In our book, Oklahomans 2, which chronicles the modern post-statehood history of our state, we introduced the notion that amidst the social and financial devastation of that debacle, God was in the wreckage, that he, in fact, animated much of the human part of that wreckage into a momentous spiritual awakening largely missed by institutional media and historians even into the 2020s. Its impact, though, has continued until then in many individual lives, as well as the comprehensive character of the state's population. Now, opinions regarding that character and the consequences of it I understand very dramatically, but its existence can scarcely be challenged. That spiritual movement in the state began a few years into the decade of the 1980s as the economy cratered. Myself, my brother, my best friend, who later became the Oklahoma County District Attorney who successfully prosecuted Oklahoma City bombing conspirator Terry Nichols, and numerous other friends, and many others, particularly in the young adult through early middle-aged baby boomer generation, turned from our riotous pursuits and followed Jesus Christ. Many returned to the faith of their childhood. Others found it for the first time. Others matured and grew strong in it. For most of this large and growing company, the pressures and disappointments of the illusory pursuits which years of affluence had rendered so accessible left us feeling hollow, disillusioned, and often depressed. This spiritual, indeed life change, curtailed much substance abuse, sexual irresponsibility, and criminality, large and small. It also increased biblical practices such as monetary contributions to religious and other charitable causes, service to the poor and needy, and attempts to repair personal moral purity and marital and other family relationships. In his best-selling book of 1980s Oklahoma entitled Belly Up, The Collapse of the Penn Square Bank, Philip Zweig captured Hennessy oilman Tom Eckroat's reflections on the bust. "It was a good thing to happen," Eckroat said. "We got back to basics. I've still got my family and friends. I'm broke, but I came in naked and I'll go out that way." This mighty move of God in Oklahoma, devastated by our 1980s economic collapse, changed thousands of lives for the better. Jane Croker of Norman is one example. Her return to her native state in 1982 to minister with her pastor husband coincided with the initial thunderclaps of economic disaster. The couple lost most of their income because most of their significant financial supporters were fighting foreclosures and bankruptcies. She gave birth to a child with a rare and devastating medical syndrome. Then she and her husband lost the health insurance they needed for the child due to their crippled income. Croker later experienced shattering brokenness in her family. Looking back, though, she reflected, "God is so good. He used all those difficult days," she said, "to change my heart, and lots of struggling people came to Jesus after seeing what the Lord could do in our difficult situation, and they trusted that he would work for them as well." Gwen, it was a tale similar to countless others from 1980s Oklahoma. Bent or even broken lives salvaged on the altar of human pride, talent, and sufficiency. As the Hebrew scriptures of long ago declared, what foolish humans meant for evil, as we blundered through our booms and our busts, God intended for good to accomplish what subsequently happened, the saving of many lives. In the 2020s, Jane Croker ministers in India with her husband and has a thriving years-long teaching and mentoring ministry to OU college women. Indeed, whether it be booms or busts, whether it be burnings or wars, whether it be tragedies of ups and downs, highs and lows, narrows and wides, there is always a golden nugget in Oklahoma history, Gwen, and I thank you for being the one to mine that and to make sure that we don't lose that in the midst of Oklahoma Gold.
So do you think the golden nugget is a philosophy?
I think hopefully it's a way of looking at life that perhaps harkens back to that pioneering frontier spirit, that even if we're not out there riding horses or, planting the fields or in a wagon, has been passed down to us through our descendants, whether we started here in Oklahoma or came from far away. And I like to think, and perhaps these last 2 years has really convinced me more than ever as I look at how unhinged other parts of the country have become, there is always a beautiful morning coming in Oklahoma.
Now that's Oklahoma Gold.